Let's now move on to our third idea. And I was trying to be a little bit witty with this, probably didn't work out so well. But in the conference, not in the paper abstract, I'd mentioned what does it mean to think about Pascal as a reader of The Prisoner's Dilemma. And what I'm pointing to here is what we could call the factor of realization for Lacan, the realization of the subject, which is an interesting but loaded concept that he doesn't fully flesh out within Function and Field. Or we could also think about what Lacan has in mind by the notion of the historicity of the subject. And what I'm essentially getting at here is the crucial factor of a type of precipitative temporality in the subject. But let's go back to Pascal as reader of The Prisoner's Dilemma. That'll be our in to this theme. One of the features which is quite striking about Function and Field is just how often Lacan refers back to his logical time paper. This is significant because, as we've already said, up until Function and Field, all of those papers are consigned to by Lacan as his antecedents. But nevertheless, the logical time paper is perhaps the one that he references the most of the earlier work. Much more so, I'm not even sure he does reference the mirror stage. So why is this logical time paper so crucial for him? Now, many of us are familiar with the central riddle, the sophism, the dilemma in logical time. So I won't replay that now. But we could briefly note what's important about it. And in fact, Dominique Holmes is here. Maybe he'll tell us later. Anyways, what are we dealing with The Prisoner's Dilemma? One way of approaching The Prisoner's Dilemma and the key challenge of logical time is that we're given there an example of an anticipatory or preemptive act on behalf of a subject, which is also determinative for the subject themselves. So let's just keep that in mind. Somehow there's an anticipatory or preemptive act or action, which, despite being anticipatory, preemptive, anticipatory, precipitative, is also somehow determinative for the subject themselves. Okay, key theme in that paper. So what we have then is a nice example of philosophical wit, where Lacan notes that Pascal's famous wager about the existence of God can be read in conjunction with his logical time paper. In other words, we're all familiar with Pascal's famous wager. Even if I do not believe in God, it makes a lot of sense to pronounce myself a believer, to act as if I do believe in God, because if I do so, only a finite loss will be incurred of the fact that God does not exist, whereas there'll be infinite gains if he does, and I am a believer. So I kind of like this crisscrossing of logical time and Pascal. But let's note a couple of points in respect of this cross-referencing that we see happening in Lacan. The first we could say of the points to be made here concerns the role of the precipitous subjective gesture, the role of identifications and desires having this precipitous anticipatory dimension runs very much counter to sequential stage theories of development and related notions of maturational periods, which we start to see in ego psychology and in post-Freudian psychoanalysis of the time. I hadn't set out to do this when starting to write up the paper, but I suppose what I'm doing here is doing a lot of work where I'm trying to show how Lacanian notions disrupt and overtly challenge commonplace notions within psychology. So that's one idea. A second moment here that's crucial to bear in mind is that I think Lacan is doing something original and important in terms of subjectivization. We could say that there are certain truth effects, certain subject effects within the clinical arena, which accrue to such a precipitous mode of temporality. Put differently, there are some truths which are only truths due to the fact that they were anticipated, that they were preempted by a subjective act of wagering. It's worthwhile stressing here that this point that I'm making about futurity, about anticipation, about an act whereby the subject both anticipates and has a determinative influence on themselves is also very much a point about speech. Lacan wants to stress throughout the paper the importance, obviously, of language and speech. And he also wants to stress that speech is what allows the subject to situate themselves relative to the future. And while we're thinking about this dimension of futurity, it's worth noting the notion of full speech. I've developed this fairly extensively elsewhere, so I won't go into it in great detail now. But let me just note that we often think about full speech as a speech before the other, which occurs via the other, of a speech which is disruptive of the ego in a way which brings with it a kind of unconscious truth possibility or an unconscious truth event. But what I started to realize in reading through the paper again is that full speech is also precipitous, preemptive speech, speech which in a sense runs ahead of the subject. And if we had to make brief reference to one of the definitions or descriptions that Lacan offers of full speech, we hear that truth is the event of full speech, he writes, in which the patient reorders past contingencies by conferring on them the sense of necessities to come. In other words, to facilitate full speech as a clinician is not only to punctuate the otherness of speech, to punctuate the materiality of the speech as it unfolds, whereby the subject says more than they realize that they are saying. To facilitate full speech is also to punctuate the subject's prospective assumption of different futures. It doesn't take a genius to work out that there's an obvious Heideggerian influence here in this dimension of an unfolding relationship to the future. But I think this is also the time to emphasize one of my favorite quotes from within the paper, where Lacan does start to speak more about, in explicit terms, the historicity of the subject. Here it is. What is realized in my history is neither the past definite as what was, since it is no more, nor even is it the past perfect of what has been and what I am, but the future anterior as what I will have been, given that I'm now in the process of becoming. A little bit of a mouthful, but we could try to parse that out by saying a couple of things. We could say that speaking in a context like that of clinical psychoanalysis, a context where the dimension of the other is consistently stressed within my speech, means that I'm forced to realize myself as something other than the ego that I suppose I am. This realization of the subject, this suggestive phrase that Lacan uses again and again, this realization of the subject, which entails the grasping of a shifting otherness to their subjectivity that exceeds their ego's sense of itself. This pertains to different times of the subject. In other words, you could say that one prospective aim or agenda of psychoanalysis is to affect the temporality of the subject, and the temporality of the subject as he or she is located both in the past, the present, and the future. We could suggest that one of the aims here is thus to disrupt the egoic imaginary relationship to the past, definite, as we saw in Lacan's quote, the present as representing the continuity of certain facets of the past into the present, and also the future. You could say that all of those modes of disruption would potentially be beneficial analytically. But I think we would be missing Lacan's point if we didn't stress that it's that dimension of the future perfect, always often referred to in the Lacanian literature, the future anterior, that Lacan wants to privilege in psychoanalytic work. And it's the future perfect, the future anterior, is that tense in which one looks towards a future event, which is nonetheless punctuated by a definitive endpoint. Maybe that's the end of analysis, maybe that's the end of one's life. The disruptive effects of otherness on the ego mean that the subject here is invited to assume the contingencies of what I will have been. I will have been, which implies that definitive endpoint, while simultaneously assuming the potential futurity of being in the process of becoming. So there's an interesting mode of temporality, which implies both that we rush forward to the end. This reminds one of Heidegger's rushing into death, an endpoint which will come, but also the fact that simultaneous to that temporality, there's the potential futurity of me being in the process of becoming. Now, we could spend a lot of time just trying to figure out all of the implications of that. But I like John Forrester's brief comment. He says, this might be likened to an unwriting of the future. And I suppose the reason I wanted to mention it is just to think and to emphasize again, let resonate this idea that such a precipitate temporality is crucial to Lacanian technique, to the realization of the subject, which is not an ego. And I think Lacan brings this issue, the subjectivization of the future, to psychoanalysis in a way that no one had done quite like that before. And just to reiterate that point as well, the clinic should thus have an intervention at different modes of the subject's temporality. There's a nice comment that I think his name's Samuel Weber, Lacan scholar, offers here. He says, in invoking the future anterior, Lacan troubles the perfected closure of the always already having been by inscribing it in the inconclusive futurity of what will always already having been. It is irreducible, this is Weber, it is an irreducible remainder or remnant that will continually prevent the subject from ever becoming entirely self-identical.